Imagine a time when power wasn't just wielded through wealth or military strength, but through fear. Raw, unrelenting fear. The Khmer Empire, one of Southeast Asia's most powerful civilizations, ruled with an iron fist, enforcing its will through some of the most brutal and unimaginable punishments in history. What if we told you these punishments were so terrifying, they've been buried in history to protect the world from their horrors? Stay with us as we uncover the dark side of the Khmer Empire, punishments so extreme you won't believe they were real. Keep watching, because these are the secrets they didn't want you to know. The Khmer Empire, once a shining jewel of Southeast Asia, ruled over vast swaths of land, from what is now Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. For centuries, the Khmer were known for their architectural marvels, such as the majestic Angkor Wat, their advanced systems of irrigation, and their flourishing trade. But behind this image of grandeur, there lurked a far darker reality, one that few are brave enough to uncover. The empire, established in the 9th century, was a behemoth that spanned multiple dynasties, each more brutal than the last. The rulers of the Khmer Empire were not content with mere subjugation through taxes or military might. They enforced power through terror. Their punishments were a tool not only to maintain control, but to instill an almost religious fear into the hearts of the people. What set them apart was their unfathomable cruelty, stretching the limits of human suffering to the extreme. One of the most infamous methods was the throat-slitting punishment. Reserved for traitors or rebels, the guilty would be placed in a public square where their sentence would be carried out with terrifying precision. The act wasn't just about death, it was about making a spectacle of the violence. The condemned person's throat would be cut in such a way that death would not come instantly, prolonging their suffering and sending a message to all who witnessed it. This form of punishment would not only mark the individual, but also burn the sight into the collective memory of the population, teaching them that betrayal would cost them their life and dignity in the most agonizing of ways. But perhaps one of the most gruesome punishments used by the Khmer Empire involved immolation, the act of burning the victim alive. For those who had committed severe crimes, such as conspiracy or attacking the empire's elite, the punishment was swift and savage. They would be chained to a wooden pillar and set alight. But the cruelty of this punishment wasn't just in the flames. It was in the slow, excruciating realization that escape was impossible. As the flames rose, the victims' screams would echo for miles, their final moments witnessed by hundreds, even thousands, of onlookers. The fire not only consumed the body, but also the spirit of defiance, as it symbolized the Khmer Empire's absolute control over life and death. Yet, the Khmer were masters of psychological punishment as much as physical brutality. The water torture was a form of punishment that preyed upon the mind. Victims would be forced to kneel in a small, water-filled room, with their heads submerged for hours. The cruelty wasn't just in the suffocation, but in the long wait, knowing that one wrong movement would result in drowning. The water would slowly rise, and each second felt like an eternity. But it wasn't just the body being punished, it was the mind. The terror of drowning, without the ability to resist, eroded any sense of agency, leaving the victim in a state of pure helplessness. Those who survived would forever be haunted by the experience, their fear of water far worse than any physical scars. As the Khmer Empire expanded, so too did the methods of punishment. Beheadings were also common, especially for the elite or high-ranking officials who had fallen from favor. But this was not the clean, swift execution we may imagine. In the Khmer Empire, the beheading was meant to be as slow and torturous as possible, with the executioner deliberately dulling the blade. It wasn't just a death sentence, it was a statement. The longer the punishment, the greater the message. The Khmer Empire's rulers were never to be defied. The suffering of the victim was paramount, and those who stood against the empire would feel the weight of it in their last moments. The Khmer also employed public execution as a powerful tool to maintain order. Criminals were tied to large wooden posts and left to suffer in full view of the public. It was not just about death, it was about humiliation. The victims would be mocked, jeered at, and often left to endure agony for hours before their final breath. This method served as a public spectacle, reminding everyone that the Khmer Empire was in charge, that to challenge it was to face the ultimate consequence, and that defiance was not merely punishable by death, but by the loss of dignity and honor. But these were not the only methods. The Khmer were notorious for their iron cage punishment. Imagine being trapped inside a small, confined space, your body contorted and unable to move. The victim would be placed in a specially crafted iron cage, often so small that the person could not sit or stand without excruciating pain. They would be left in these cages to die from exposure, starvation, or thirst, depending on the severity of their crime. The sight of a once proud human being reduced to a broken shell of themselves was a haunting reminder to the people of the Khmer Empire that even the strongest could be reduced to nothing in an instant. The terror instilled by these punishments was not just for those who directly suffered. It was meant to infect the entire population. Fear became the Khmer's most effective weapon. People were not only afraid for their own lives, but also for the lives of their families and loved ones. One wrong move could lead to unbearable suffering. Disobedience became unthinkable because of the cruel and shocking punishments that could await anyone who crossed the line. Even more chilling was the fact that these punishments were often carried out without any trial or form of justice. The ruling elite, whether emperors or high-ranking officials, could mete out these tortures at will. The Khmer didn't just control their people, they dominated their very existence from birth to death. As we continue our journey through the gruesome history of the Khmer Empire, the scale of its cruelty becomes even more apparent. The punishment wasn't just for the common folk or the criminals. Even the slightest mistakes by the ruling elite could lead to unimaginable suffering. And in the case of royal punishment, the methods were even more sinister. One of the most terrifying and painful punishments within the Khmer court was the snake pit. This method was reserved for high-ranking officials who had lost favor with the king or had been accused of treason. They would be thrown into a deep pit filled with venomous snakes, where they would be left to die a slow, painful death. It wasn't just about the poison. It was the terror of knowing that death would not come swiftly. The victim could watch as the snakes circled and struck, their body growing weak from venom, yet their death would only come after an agonizing battle for survival. The punishment was as much about psychological torment as it was about physical agony. The snakes were often released at night, with the victim unable to escape or flee, trapped in a battle with the creatures of darkness. But the Khmer Empire's punishments didn't always involve physical torture. Psychological warfare was just as crucial in the system of control. The burying alive punishment was one of the most disturbing and effective ways to break someone's spirit. For those deemed enemies of the state, particularly spies or traitors, the Khmer would bury them alive in a sealed pit. The only thing the condemned could do was scream for mercy that would never come. It wasn't just about the suffocation. It was about the sheer helplessness, the terror of being swallowed by the earth itself. The slow erosion of hope was what made this punishment so effective. When the body finally succumbed, the person had already died many deaths in their mind. In some cases, the Khmer would also use limb removal as punishment. Rebels and thieves found guilty of defying the empire were subjected to this harrowing form of justice. The criminals would be tied to a post or laid down while their limbs were amputated with crude tools. This wasn't an act of mercy. It was meant to demonstrate the Khmer Empire's absolute dominance. Those who survived often ended up as beggars, their bodies maimed and their futures destroyed. Even the thought of such a punishment struck fear into the hearts of the people. It wasn't just the loss of a limb, it was the loss of dignity, the destruction of any possibility of redemption. Perhaps one of the most horrifying punishments was the flesh-ripping technique. The victim would be tied to a stone slab, and the executioner would use sharp tools to rip the flesh off the person's body. This form of punishment was often used for those who had been found guilty of theft or other lesser offenses. But it wasn't just about causing pain. It was about making an example of the criminal. The Khmer rulers wanted to ensure that the crime was never repeated, and the terror of watching someone's skin torn away served as a stark reminder of the consequences of defiance. The Khmer were also known for their feeding to wild animals punishment, which involved feeding the victim alive to hungry wild animals such as tigers, crocodiles, or even elephants. Often, this method was carried out in public places where the entire community could watch the victim's last moments as they were devoured by animals. The brutality of this punishment was not just in the method, but in the spectacle of it. It was designed to break the spirit of the population, to remind them of their powerlessness under the rule of the Khmer. But it wasn't just criminals who faced these fates. The sacrifice of human life was a practice among the Khmer elites, used to appease their gods or to show their immense power. During times of war or great unrest, the Khmer would conduct human sacrifices. These victims were often chosen from their own people, often without any warning. The chosen individuals would be led to the temple, where they would be ritually killed in front of thousands of witnesses. These public executions were meant to serve as offerings to the gods, ensuring that the empire's rule remained unchallenged. The sacrifice was a display of both spiritual and political power, showing that the Khmer were willing to spill the blood of their own people for the preservation of their empire. Even after death, the punishments didn't stop. Desecration of the body was another way the Khmer rulers controlled their subjects. For those who were executed or killed in battle, their bodies would often be desecrated, mutilated beyond recognition, to ensure that no one would dare rise up again. The mutilation was public, meant to strike fear into the hearts of any who might think to rebel against the Khmer. But despite all these brutal tactics, the Khmer Empire's methods of control were not without resistance. Over time, as the empire began to weaken, many of these punishments began to lose their grip on the people. Resistance movements rose, and the very fear that the Khmer had instilled into the population began to unravel. As we look back at the Khmer Empire and the horrors they inflicted on their own people, we realize that these acts of cruelty were not merely about maintaining order. They were designed to create a world where fear was the currency, where rebellion was unthinkable, and where the Khmer rulers could remain in power at any cost. The brutal punishments served as tools for control, but they also served as dark symbols of what humanity can become when power is held by those willing to sacrifice others to maintain it.